I am pleased. I'm Jim Gilmore, as all of you all know, the former ambassador of the OSCE in Vienna, Austria. And the panel today is the question of the near abroad, which I think is certainly part and parcel of the much larger strategic issues that I think that we're facing today with the initiative of Russia and China. As these near abroad, they're all members, all of these near abroad countries, all the way through the Baltics, the Balkans, Central Asia, all of them are members of the OSCE. They're all sovereign countries in the OSCE. They're not really behaving like satraps, if you will, or extensions of the Soviet Empire. They're behaving as independent countries. And that especially includes Ukraine, and that has shaped much of my thinking about public policy. We have here three very distinguished panelists. I propose to say a few words at the beginning of what I think is important, very briefly, and then turn this really over to these three high caliber people with no particular order in mind, although it's just printed Linas and the Admiral and the Marta in that order. So unless there's a better idea, I think I will move in that direction. You all have the biographies of these three distinguished individuals. Linas is obviously, first of all, he's from California, but we'll forgive that. And instead focus on his contacts and experience, particularly with the Baltic community, both in his family background, but also his professional experience. The Admiral, naturally, we have the benefit of the Admiral's experience. He's a dean of the Center for Maritime Strategy. He is a practical, real military commander, having commanded the USS Oklahoma. He is an expert in the role of the Navy in international affairs. He's particularly experienced with the Balkans, the Mediterranean, the Black Sea region. And then we have also Marta Kepe, with the RAND Corporation, the organization I'm particularly familiar with. Her experience is primarily with the Baltics, and I'm glad about that. And she's an experienced person with the U.S. allied capabilities with respect to sustainment, Russia, irregular warfare, civilian-based resistance, which is not just for the Baltics, although that could come to pass in the future, but also with respect to the entire conflicts that are going on. I just want to say something very quickly and then turn it over, I think, in that order. I am struck by reading the history of Russia, which I believe is the primary problem right now, because Putin has, in fact, pulled the trigger. He's done a military invasion, so deterrence has failed with respect to the American policy of deterrence has failed with respect to Russia. And now we're in it, and Putin's in it. And as I said in my question, I don't know that Putin expected to be in this thing this way this long, and would probably like to get out. And now he can't because he sacrificed 700,000 of his own people. So how's he going to turn around and turn tail and run? He can't do that. And yet the problem is that we can't let him win. So I think that this panel is useful in discussing all of the big pictures. As I went back yesterday and I looked at 1989, I come away with the history of Russia more optimistic if we could get out of this problem that Putin has put us in. In 1989, Gorbachev actually took Russia in a very positive direction that ended up, of course, with the dissolution of the Soviet Union. The principles at that time the United States was following, particularly James Baker, was that he wanted to bring about in the new Russian area self-determination, recognition of borders, preservation of human rights, and respect of international law. All of those principles have been violated now by Vladimir Putin in his war and the question is that going to be the future for the 21st century? Putin has said exactly what he thinks, which is that the dissolution of the Soviet Union was the greatest tragedy of the 20th century. And in my view, he's trying to reverse history and bring back the good old days of Russian authoritarianism and the empire. And Ukraine is the very first step, but I think the panelists may give us an opinion as to whether the other near abroad countries in Central Asia, the Baltics, the Balkans, and other places, Georgia, Moldova, are next. It really depends a lot on what you think Russia's trying to do. If they're trying to defend themselves and they're scared of NATO, then that's one construct. I don't actually believe that's what's going on because I've read the Tucker Carlson interview. I strongly disapprove of Tucker Carlson giving Putin that platform, but he did. And I've actually read what Putin said. And Putin basically said, I'm going back to the Middle Ages and I'm going to reconstruct the Russian Empire. That's what I'm going to do. Well, that has a direct impact on what's going on in all of the areas that these three panelists can talk about, if that's in fact what he plans to do. He said he did. I tend to believe. I came away from that interview and I asked myself the question, does Putin really believe this? Or is this, or is he just politically posturing? My rough conclusion was he actually believes this stuff. And that has a direct bearing upon policymaking in the United States and the future of the so-called near abroad. So I'm looking forward to hearing from these panelists. I'm not sure I want to try to direct them, at least not certainly right at the beginning. But let's go in the proper order that we just talked about. And I might mention, by the way, Linas, it's Kojelis, isn't it, Linas? Linas and I are old friends. He was actually engaged in Virginia politics when I was coming along to Virginia politics, and we were friends. He moved to California, but he's back now to talk to us about this policy, and I'm delighted, Linas, that you're here. Please take the turn and tell us what you think.
I'll start with one of the highest compliments I've ever been paid in my life, sir. Every year, the Virginia Republicans, and I was chairman of the Petersburg Republican Committee, meet the Hoffman Advance up in the Olmsted Resort, and I was getting deeply involved. I was on the State Central Committee of Virginia, and there was an open seat for the state senate, the 16th district. And I mentioned in one plenary session that I was thinking of perhaps running for that seat. And Governor Gilmore stands up and says, "Run, Linas, run." I consider that one of the greatest compliments of my life. Thank you, sir. And the second of all, congratulations on the wonderful articles you wrote while you were in Europe. I read them on LinkedIn. You posted them all the time. Absolutely spot on. It was like once a week or every other week. They were just really a wonderful analysis of what was going on in Europe with Russia and so forth. Just a few things. Once again, I am not just of Lithuanian heritage. My father, my first memories of life are actually from Monterey, California. I heard yesterday that many of you either attended or even taught at the Army Language School. In the late 50s, they were still teaching Lithuanian and Latin and Estonian at the Army Language School in Monterey. And my understanding would be there's no reason to do that except for preparing for the possibility of a hot war with the Soviet Union, that you would send these training soldiers. And my father was a teacher behind the enemy lines and dropped them into the Baltic states. In the case, the balloon went up, say, in the late 50s, but then that ended in the 60s, and we moved back to Los Angeles. I didn't even speak English before I started kindergarten in Los Angeles public schools. And the second of all, I just want to say that our house was not politically so much a Lithuanian house as a Baltic house. We had Estonians and Latins coming to our house for meetings on how to lobby Congress and President Johnson and so forth. The issue then was for the U.S. to raise the issue of the Baltic states at the United Nations, to make it a live issue, not a dead issue. So it was a very important work that was done then. After the Reagan administration, I was the last position as Deputy Assistant Secretary for Refugee Admissions at State. I served the U.S. Baltic Foundation and traveled very extensively, at least 4 times a year, to all 3 countries for democracy building programs. A lot were in the area of municipal, but just in terms of general attitudes of the Baltic states towards Russia and America. Towards Russia, one thing that absolutely impressed me, and I was just talking to Ambassador Ross about this, was there was some sentiment as they were breaking away. Should we ask for reparations from Russia? The Baltic states had some of the highest standard of living in the 20s. They started at the bottom of the barrel after 1918. And by 1939, they had very high standards of living, higher than Finland. And then when the Soviets came in, they took everything down. They destroyed the economies and businesses and industries and so forth, collectivized the farms and so forth. Is that should we ask, in 1990, 91, 92 for reparations from Russia? And absolute consensus, whatever voices there were for that, were absolutely smothered by the sound voices of the Baltic people, which was, that's history. Let's forget what the Russians did to us the last 50 years. Let's look to the future. Let's use our intelligence, our smarts, our academic knowledge, our dynamism, and our desire to be part of the West in technology and science and industry and computer sciences. Lithuania in the Soviet time has built the only personal computers in the Soviet Union. And in fact, if you look at Soviet aerospace and military equipment, rockets and planes, and the entire, from technological point, a lot of the basic research was done in the Baltic states. They didn't trust the Baltic people to apply this knowledge to tanks and planes and rockets and so forth. But the basic in refrigeration, metallurgy, and so forth was done in the Baltic states. So to take that knowledge and apply it to business and industries that would be of interest to the West and the United States. So the fact that they just turned, not that they turned their back to Russia, if they were producing cheese and there was a market for that in Leningrad or St. Petersburg, yeah, I'll sell cheese to St. Petersburg. But everything else, and I know that in the 90s, well, certainly at the start of this century, what they referred to as the Baltic Tigers, and they are. Their standards of living, I think, by European standards, by EU standards, they're above Portugal, they're above Greece, and so forth now. So you have that, the general Western outlook. The United States, somebody mentioned about the previous administration that American presence in any form, business, military, academic, cultural. And in fact, I'm thinking of putting together something called the Ronald Reagan Film Festival in Lithuania next year. There's this great thirst for American things. And I think that Russia monitors how much America is promoted in the Baltic states. There's no limit. There's no limit to I mean, the American brand is golden, I think, in the Baltic states, certainly in Lithuania, and it always has been. So that NATO is important, having American troop presence is important. Hopefully, I don't know, there's a discussion now whether Lithuania is going to buy Leopard or Abrams tanks. Philip Ambassador Hughes and I had some discussion about that last night. Lithuania just approved $1.2 billion. Germany promised to place a permanent amount of troops in Lithuania if Lithuania built the infrastructure. And Lithuania promised just approved $1.2 billion build that infrastructure in eastern Lithuania toward the Belarus border. Finally, and it's interesting because I really haven't been involved in Baltic affairs. It's a little bit like Michael Corleone in Godfather 3. It's like every time I try to get out, they drag me back in. And 6 weeks ago, I was on a secure, I hope I'm going to put a cone of silence over this room here, so nobody repeat what I'm about to say to you. But a secure conference broadcast from the president's office in Vilnius with about 5 people from the president's office, 5 or 6 from the parliament, 5 or 6 from the government. And the issue was planning for the possible Russian invasion of Lithuania. And the specific topic was refugees, the sort of movement of people within Lithuania, and then whether or not they could be transported to Europe and the United States. And as I said, my last job in the state was Deputy Assistant Secretary of Refugees. At the time, Gorbachev opened the door to Soviet Jewish immigration. When I started my job, we were getting about 150 Soviet Jews. At the time, they were coming into Austria on transit visas. And within months, it went to 1,500 to 3,000 to 4,500 a month coming out of the Soviet Union, and most of them decided to come to America. And my budget just doubled. Congress just doubled it from 120 to 240 million a year, which in 2024 dollars would be $500 million for the processing of Soviet Jews. So I was invited to this conference, and there were maps of showing where the Russians would come in and so forth. What I'm saying, and what's interesting is that the people from all 3 of those, the president's office, the other 2, government and the parliament, were like in their 20s and 30s and 40s. It's a whole new generation than what I had worked with in the 90s. And it's just very exciting to see how professional, how organized, and how serious they are planning for likelihood of a Russian attack. This is just 6 weeks ago, so they're not sleeping.
Well, I was in Lithuania about 6 months ago briefly for a conference, and they flew in quietly leaders from Ukraine also, so it turned out to be a 3-country conference that was held. But I came away with this impression that the Lithuanians expected there might be a Russian invasion at some point, and they were determined to resist. Now, we Americans participate in politics, but we don't think if it goes haywire, we're going into a concentration camp. We're getting murdered. But they do, don't they? I mean, it takes a lot of courage to participate in national Lithuanian politics if you think that the Russians are coming, because that is life and death.
Well, my mother's family had 11 siblings, plus parents and so forth. Dad's had 9. I think about 6 or 7 of them got to America. Everyone else was rounded up and sent to Siberia. After we got back to Los Angeles, my earliest memories of Los Angeles was Global Parcel Service, right on Broadway, downtown Los Angeles. My mom went there, took me by the hand. It was like that last scene in Indiana Jones and the Lost Ark. It seemed to have this huge fluid room with brown and gray boxes everywhere. It was the only service in Los Angeles that guaranteed delivery of a package to Siberia. And with my mom making sure that there were gloves, and socks, and scarves, and cigarettes. And she insisted that the American cigarettes sent to her brothers and my father's brothers and sisters in Siberia. And they think that, and one time, one of my cousins got very sick, and we got medicines to them and saved his life. And of course, the cigarettes we use not for smoking, but as currency. The Moreau, Virginia.
We'll keep making.
So all of my cousins and aunts and uncles were deported to Siberia. Oh, grandparents, little kids, 1-year-old and the 85-year-old, all of them. So they know Siberia, and they were there until Khrushchev. I think they went, we report about 48, 49 by Stalin, and didn't come back until Khrushchev.
Well, history doesn't change a lot. As we know, Navalny was sent exactly to those camps and murdered there. So the reality of what's going on in near abroad and what they face is very real. Let me turn to Admiral. Is it pronounced?
Foggo.
Foggo.
Yes, sir.
Admiral Foggo.
Admiral Foggo, who, as I said, has actual experience in the United States Navy as a combatant commander of our submarine facilities and our submarine force, and has some direct experience with this. And I'd like to hear what you have to say, Admiral.
Yes, sir. First of all, Governor Gilmore, thank you very much for inviting. One of the things that I should mention is probably the most important part of my resume is, like you, sir, I am a Virginian. And, but before I was a Virginian, I was not an American citizen. I was naturalized. I've been a Virginian since 1968. My father was a Canadian military attaché here in Washington, D.C. I grew up, I was born in Rymedale in Virginia at NATO Northern Army Headquarters. Both my grandfathers fought in World War I, highly decorated, Croix de Guerre, Military Cross, one below the Victoria Cross. One continued service in World War II. My father hit the beach in Normandy in 1944. And so when I grew up as a kid, he would remind me of where I was born. I was born at a NATO base, and he would say, you don't want to be involved in a war. You want to deter war, and that's why NATO is such a great organization. So for the last 110 years, every male descendant of my grandfathers has been in uniform. My son is a West Point grad, commissioned in the Navy wisely, but he will sit on the opposite side of the field with me on December 14th at FedEx Field when we face one another. That's okay. So it's a pleasure to be here. And Sébastien, excellent exposé. Comme je suis francophone, je fais mes études à l'Institut d'études politiques entre 87 et 89 en tant que lieutenant de vaisseau US Navy. C'était an experience vraiment magnifique. So I did some studies in France as a lieutenant and continued to rise in the submarine force. I commanded at all levels, and I was lucky. I spent 12 years in Europe in 9 different commands and had a lot of time in the high north, even twice at the North Pole. So I'm a strong believer in the importance of the Baltic Sea region. And Marta's going to tell us more about that from her experience as a former Latvian. But I'll tell you what I did as a naval officer. I've been there many times. The first time was in 1985 on board the submarine USS Sea Devil, when we actually surfaced and went through the Kattegat, Skagerrak, and Stora belts into the Baltic. It's one of the most exhilarating maneuvering watches I've ever had. The takeaways from that were it's a very vibrant region. It's also a contested region. And I was fortunate to go back in 2015 as the commander of the U.S. Sixth Fleet, and also a separate command. So Sixth Fleet is in Naples, Italy. The Striking and Support Forces NATO command for NATO's integration of carrier strike groups is in Lisbon, Portugal. I was dual commander. Strike Force NATO is responsible for the execution of an exercise we do annually in June called Baltops. I was fortunate to be the commander of Baltops in 2015. It's been going on since 1971. It's the first time a NATO commander had taken command of Baltops. Now you say NATO commander. I was an American, but I was a NATO commander. And that was significant because 2015 was the year after the Russians illegally annexed Ukraine, and we kicked them out of the exercise. They were participants in 2013 with their amphibious assault ships, if you can believe that. So this was a very tense time in the Baltic region. We did amphibious landings all over the Baltic. And I had the benefit of actually staying in command of Sixth Fleet for 2 years. So I got a redo. I got a chance to do it again. And having done it once in 2015, 2016 was even better. Now, why do I say that? There were a lot of wins for NATO and for the United States Navy, and a lot of embarrassing losses for Russia. This is one of them here, if you can see this photo. So as I prepared the force to go back up into the Baltic through the Skagerrak and Store Belt, very difficult maneuver to watch. If you ever minded, you would close the Baltic off. I told my commanding officers, if an untoward incident happens with the Russians, I subscribe to the Mattis principle of Secretary Mattis, former Secretary of Defense. Everybody loved that guy. And he said, if you don't get a picture or a video, it didn't happen. So I sent this destroyer, USS Donald Cook, in international waters off the coast of Kaliningrad, which is a Russian bastion. It's probably by density got the most dense population of Russian weapons in any facility in the world. That's where the Baltic Fleet is. And while the Donald Cook was patrolling, well outside of, or in international waters, outside of territorial waters, the Russians recognized her presence and gave her a welcoming party. So they overflew her both recklessly and dangerously with a number of aircraft, including this, which is a Su-35 Sukhoi aircraft. While that aircraft came dangerously close to the Donald Cook, the commanding officer had 6 combat cameramen on each bridge wing. So he got a commendation from me for doing what I told him to do, because he got the photo. The other thing that was going on, which was very dangerous, is we had a Polish helicopter, Mi-17, that had done deck landing quals, in other words, landed on the deck of USS Donald Cook, and done an evolution. It's a tactical evolution called a hot pump. A hot pump means you don't shut the rotors down on the helicopter while you refuel. That's very dangerous, because we shut the rotors down on our helicopters in normal peacetime conditions, so there are no sparks that would cause that fuel to explode. But in this case, we were training like we were going to fight. That helo was simulated to be out of fuel. She needed to land on a lily pad someplace. That was USS Donald Cook. So she sat down, rotors turning, and our guys ran out to fuel her. That's when that Su-35 came across the horizon at about 400 knots. And the wingtip of the Su-35 to the bridge of the Donald Cook, the distance was somewhere between 5 and 10 feet. Oh, so when I got that photo, I was at NATO headquarters with the Supreme Allied Commander, General Breedlove. And this photo popped on my secure laptop, and I showed it to him. And he looked at it and he said, oh my God. I said, sir, you were an F-16 pilot during the Cold War. Would you have ever done anything like this? He goes, hell no. If that Russian pilot had sneezed, he would have buried his wing into the bridge of the USS Donald Cook. And then that would have torn the wing off. The aircraft would have crashed, and the Russians would have accused us of shooting it down. And I said, you're exactly right, sir. So this photo is classified secret. I'd like your permission to classify it and get it out onto the news. And he said, permission granted. This photo went around the world, viral, in about 3 hours. Every major news network picked up this photo. Secretary of State John Kerry saw this on the news and sent a note back to Commander UCOM and said, why didn't they shoot it down? Well, there's a reason we didn't shoot it down, because the commanding officer is in tactical command of the situation, and he wasn't stupid. Shooting down a Russian aircraft could have led to a much greater conflict. So we kept this cool, and instead we embarrassed the Russians by releasing this photo, showing their recklessness, showing their want to try to get into a fight with the Americans. And President Putin was so incensed by this, because it was embarrassing to him, and he didn't think that the Baltic Fleet commander had done enough to push back against NATO or the Americans. And the headline in the Daily Mail after the incident was, Putin fired the Russian 3-star fleet commander and 49 of his staff officers. So when I left 6th Fleet, my staff gave me this framed print with the photo and said, Foggo 50, Putin 0. Without firing a shot. That's the way you want it. And that's, in a certain way, deterrence, pushing back against an enemy aggression. So since that time, and at that time, I would ask our Swedish friends as we're on the beach in Ravalunda, Sweden, hey, when are you guys going to join NATO? Same with the Finns. They were partnership for peace nations. And they said, you know what? We love exercising with you guys, but we have no intention of joining the alliance. If it was up to us in the military, yeah, it'd be great. But it's up to the people of Sweden and Finland, and there is just no mandate. My, how that has turned around. So as a result of Putin's aggression, and we say Putin is the gift that keeps on giving, Sweden and Finland have become members of NATO. So now there's this air of overconfidence and arrogance in the Baltic Sea region. And some people say, well, the Baltic is now a NATO lake. I think that's very dangerous rhetoric. It's nowhere near a NATO lake. And we could go to war with the Russians over Kaliningrad tomorrow. So we need to be vigilant, on guard, and we need to bolster our deterrent capabilities. Some of the observations that I made after that first deployment up there on the USS Oklahoma in 1985, we'd just come back from surfacing at the North Pole. It was great. Saw polar bears, candy striped the periscope, got the biggest, fattest chief on board to dress up like Santa Claus, and somebody smuggled a bottle of bourbon, and we put an igloo in a bar out there, and every kid on the ship got a shot of whiskey, and it was off the ship, so it was okay. But my observations were this region is in constant tension. Look at what happened in World War I, World War II, submarine wars, Battle of Jutland, the Cold War, and then a reset, which really never happened. You know, Francis Fukuyama's end of history never really gave us the peace dividend that we want. And we're now in a new Cold War. As I was discussing with the governor, we're in phase 2. We might as well be in combat operations right now. The Baltic, on the other hand, is a very vibrant region. There's a lot of business, there's a lot of shipping, a lot of fishing, a lot of tourism. If you don't believe me, you go out there, take the opportunity to go to a place called Bjornholm Island, a Danish property right in the mouth of the Baltic. Sits there as a listening post during the Cold War. They had a role in World War II. The Russians were there after the Cold War, or during the Cold War, and after World War II, and they wouldn't leave. They liked it so much. It's got the best smoked fish restaurant in the Baltic, and cruise ships pull in there, multiple ships every day to go to this restaurant. So the Danes took me to this restaurant. We had a special table, thousands of people there, and it was indeed the best smoked fish I'd ever had. So business is important, and people want to live a peaceful life, but they're under constant threat of this dark cloud that is over their head. It's a very constrained environment. It's a bathtub. So you have to go through this very narrow strait to get into the bathtub. And if you ever had to fight a war in there or do something to try to blunt the weapons that are in Kaliningrad, it would be very nasty. By the way, those weapons and that fleet and those aircraft with Zircon hypersonics and Caliber class cruise missiles, like a Tomahawk missile in our inventory, range of over 1,000 miles. They use it all the time in Ukraine. They can reach anywhere they want, any capital in the region. So we should be very circumspect about that. The other thing is, I talked about mines. If you wanted to shut down the Danish Straits, it'd be very easy with a diesel electric submarine or a merchant ship, just toss them overboard. And if you can't get in there, you can't resupply. So we have to maintain a mine countermeasures capability, and sadly, the United States Navy has allowed that skill to atrophy. We were supposed to put it on our littoral combat ship. That whole modular mine warfare thing failed. So we depend on the Europeans. And I told the Europeans every time I was up there for the Baltops, don't give away your minesweepers. We need them. You're going to need them because the Americans are not going to come and do this for you. And so you have to keep that capability. Because of budgets, they let that skill atrophy there too, and I'm very concerned about that. Lastly, I'll tell you, land armies just don't cut it. When I talked to the 3 chiefs of defense of the 3 Bs, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, all 4-star Army officers are like, the Navy commanders in those countries, most of them aren't even admirals, they're captains, and it's a 500-person Navy. They need to upgun that Navy because they're going to need reinforcement from the sea if they ever get into a fight with the Russians. And the Russians will go through the lines to the capitals in the 3 Bs in about 2 weeks max. The last couple of things I'll tell you is you saw the headlines yesterday and the day before. Critical undersea infrastructure in the Baltic is under attack. So Nord Stream 2, Burke's still out on that. Nobody who did it. And it's a nefarious kind of web of intrigue. But there were 2 cables cut in 2022 between Estonia and Finland. Supposedly, the Chinese merchant ship, the new Polar Bear, forgot to pull up its anchor and drug it across the Baltic for over 100 kilometers. They wrecked two transmission cables that carried intelligence and electronic information and market information. They also cut and damaged the Baltic Connector pipeline, which is gas. And just this past week, somebody cut the cable between Germany and Finland. Now they'll go out and repair it. And the German defense minister said, well, it wasn't Finland, it wasn't Germany. I can tell you it wasn't the United States. So who was it? I'm sure you can guess. NATO has created a counter critical undersea infrastructure cell. I am one of the two 4-star senior mentors for NATO. I report directly to the Supreme Allied Commander, Chris Cavoli, and he picked a German officer, Hans Wehrmann, to be the head of this critical undersea warfare cell that's trying to blunt attacks on pipelines and cables. But it is not enough. Any more than it is in this country. I love Congressman Whitman. He came up with legislation in the NDA a couple of years ago to create cable ships that would go out and monitor our cables. $1 trillion a day passing across the Atlantic of economic information and security information on our cables. And we funded 2 ships to take care of cable repair. That's nowhere near enough. Finally, the United States, when I hear from the allies that the U.S. is withdrawing from Europe, makes me cringe. My entire family history is in conflict on the continent of Europe. I'm a Virginian. I believe in the motto on our state flag, sic semper tyrannis, thus always deterrence. So I believe in a strong defense. I believe in deterrence. When people tell me you're pulling back from Europe, I say, then why don't we stand up a brand new Joint Force Command in Norfolk, Virginia called Joint Force Command Norfolk? It had 3-star officer who's a fleet commander. I am his mentor, Admiral Doug Perry. And he has ships, he has carriers, he has a command. He may be a 3-star, but he has co-equal status to when I was Joint Force Command Naples, or the Italian and German 4-star was Joint Force Command in Brunson. And that triangle completes the transatlantic bridge to provide security. And the Americans, with the exception of mine warfare, we're going to be the fastest ones on the draw. Those carrier strikers are nuclear powered. Those ships can go very fast, very quickly, and they carry 70 attack aircraft. And you've seen what they've done in the Eastern Mediterranean, preventing war in Lebanon and blunting Iranian attacks on Israel. There is no substitute for those carriers. And if anything, we need more of them. So, highly contested region. We could do a lot more. Budgets are tight. The attention of the United States is focused on the Western Pacific, but also mired in the conflicts in the Middle East and in Ukraine. So there are more challenges. I did 40 years in uniform, 4 years of Naval Academy. If you count that, that's 44 years of service to this country. And I have never seen the United States of America surrounded by more adversaries at any other time in my life. I laud you, diplomats, for your service. So much so that I was privileged to become a member of the American Academy of Diplomacy. I think you have 5 officers like me and about 300 FSOs and ambassadors. I'm on the board with Ambassador Ron Newman. I believe in diplomacy. Deterrence, defense, and Jens Stoltenberg used to tell me there's a third D. What's that? Dialogue. And he was absolutely right. And that's what you do. So privileged to be here today, sir. Hope I didn't go on too long, but that's kind of my pitch on the whole thing.
Thank you, Admiral. And, I might mention, as Linas was talking about the Defense Language Institute, I actually attended that institute when I was in the Army. I learned German there. But what your comments have been, the military response that you were personally involved with. And what I've tried to say today is my alarm, because I feel like that deterrence has failed in Europe and that Putin has pulled the trigger. And now we're in this problem of what happens post-deterrence. But your experience seems to be that you were engaged in this almost all the time. What is your attitude about the deterrence? Can that still occur because of military involvement and work with the Navy?
I think it can, sir, as long as we keep NATO strong. One of the things I think Putin fears, his worst nightmare would be an extended conflict in Europe where NATO actually turned on him. And we'd wipe out the Russian forces in a heartbeat. I mean, with the combined arms that we have over there. We use a lot of missiles, so the missile battery and magazine are low. But if you ever cross the line in Article 5, which is an attack on one is an attack on all, the only time NATO's ever used it is in 9/11, and the attack on us. I think we roll right through. It'd be a very bloody conflict and nobody wants to go there. So this cat and mouse game, tit for tat, goes on all the time. Sometimes we make bad decisions. So in December of 2021, before the invasion of Ukraine in February 2022, the United States had 3 ships in the Black Sea. USS Mount Whitney, our command ship, the destroyers USS Porter and USS Arleigh Burke. In December of that year, prior to the invasion in February, we pulled those ships out. We had a regular presence in the Black Sea when I was over there. I think that was a mistake because we substituted real forward presence for virtual presence. And guess what? The Turks came out with this soft decree, hey, we don't want any non-riparian nations, those who are not actually contiguous nations to the Black Sea, to put any kind of warships back into the Black Sea. The U.S. has honored that, but I think once you leave, it's like a non-combatant evacuation operation. One of the toughest decisions I think ambassadors have to make is, am I going to do a NEO and shutter the embassy? Once you leave, it's very hard to get back in. Now that we've left the Black Sea, it's going to be very hard to get back in. And the biggest problem there right now, mines. It's going to take years to demine what the Russians, the Ukrainians, and other actors have done there. And we don't have a mine countermeasures presence. Had we maintained a foothold in the Black Sea, we could have easily transited minesweepers up there to take care of business. But now the Turks are calling the shots. So I think that was a mistake.
All right, well, thank you very much. I want to turn to Marta. Marta, it occurs to me that what we have seen, I'm not sure whether my mic is on or not. Can you all hear me? Okay. It is on. I'm sure I think I lost it. Oh, the microphone. There we go. Sorry about that. I'm a lousy moderator. What I've noticed is the methodology that the Russians have been using to carry out their mission. Now, I've raised the fundamental question, are the Russians offensive or defensive? Are they trying to protect themselves by all of this and see themselves being put upon by NATO and by America, or whether they actually are trying to do what he said he was going to do in the Tucker Carlson interview, which is trying to be offensive and reassemble the Russian Empire. But I noticed when I was there in Europe and watching what was going on in Crimea and in eastern Ukraine, that Putin is actually pretty cautious with his methodology. He tends to use proxy forces, indigenous proxy forces, instead of putting in troops and getting those people to pretend like they are actually representatives of the people in these areas in Crimea and eastern Ukraine, and then only move Russian assets in when the countries themselves appear to ask for it. So in the case of the Baltics, particularly Estonia, why don't they just simply use Estonian fellow travelers to pretend that they are being put upon with the way that they said in Crimea and in other places, and actually then say that they're representatives of those 3 Baltic countries, and they're pulling themselves out of NATO. And then meanwhile, then Putin would be in a position to say, well, then we can move in troops to protect our Baltic friends and our fellow travelers and our fellow Slavs and so on like that, and then carry out his political mission with gradually and carefully, as opposed to just simply doing the invasion, which is why I have expressed repeatedly today such alarm about the failure of deterrence by actual military invasion in Ukraine, because I think it's a game changer from that cautious approach that I'm pointing out. What is your thoughts about the threat to the Baltic? You're an expert. You're the real expert here on this panel from Rand Corporation with respect to this, and particularly civilian-based resistance. What is your thought about the risk to the Baltics?
Well, first, I hope this works. It does. Thank you very much for the invitation for me to speak here today. And it's really a hard act to follow these two speakers. They're amazing. I'm also a Virginian, but I was born in Soviet-occupied Latvia. So a lot of the history that we're talking about here is part of my lived experience. I was myself a participant in the Baltic chain in 1989 in August, which was done on the 50th anniversary of the secret Ribbentrop-Molotov pact that divided the areas of influence. I was there for the barricades. Truth be told, I was quite young, so probably did not completely understand the sort of weight and importance of those events. And later on, as a professional, as a defense analyst, I've been actually working and analyzing the region and the sort of Russian threat as well. So, I wanted to start with some sort of main points that I wanted to highlight. And one thing is the sort of Russian interest in the Baltic states. I think for me, and I also teach Nordic Baltic security in Georgetown, where I really like to cover quite a bit of history, because especially in Europe and especially in the Nordic Baltic countries, people, there's the saying of look towards the future, but remember the past. I'm probably sort of representing the saying, but it's sort of the history, the past is always in the minds of people as they're looking towards the future. And within that mindset, I think it's important to remember that Russia was not always in the Baltic states, right? It's only around the time of Ivan the Terrible, a little bit later, when Russia starts actively sort of thinking about gaining ground and influence in that region. Previously, you would have, German tribes or German orders coming over towards the Baltics and Poland in the 1200s. We have Vikings and the sort of Nordic tradesmen that were very interested in the pathway between Estonia and Finland, because that is where they had access to the rivers that took them all the way lower. Like, it was a very important trade link. And then, in fact, Gotland was a big stop. It was a sort of a hub for that trade at the time. So, relative, sort of in the big scheme of things and of history, sort of relatively recent. At the same time, also, what I hear from a lot of my friends who go to, say, Latvia or Estonia, they're often surprised. It actually feels more maybe Germanic, maybe more Scandinavian than Russian. And it is because of this very strong German and Nordic influence that continued even under the Russian Empire. So that's one sort of aspect that I wanted to mention. The other thing is so what are the Russian threats, military threats, but also hybrid or radar threats of today? So in terms of military threats, I'd say overall, yes, military threat continues, but at the same time, what we do have is that the land force formations that used to be sort of positioned near the Baltic, but also now we have Finland and NATO, Nordic, Finnish borders are really decimated. And why are they decimated? Because they have been fighting Ukraine. Russia has announced and actually have been implementing new plans for the free constitution and restructuring of the northwest military districts. And there is some sort of rebuilding of subunits. But again, these subunits are built and then they're sent to fight in Ukraine at the moment. From my position, Admiral Foggo already covered a lot of ground, so I don't have to repeat. From my position, from where I sit, I wanted to highlight the continued importance of Kaliningrad, because even if we don't have the ground units necessarily that strong, we still have capabilities that can be used in the area, and also the importance of the sort of air defense capabilities that are in the St. Petersburg area as well, that have quite a range as well. So at the same time, the discussion, conversation, also the pronouncements of the Baltic leaders and European leaders as well about, okay, what is the Russian military threat? It's very much linked to the conversation of Russian military reconstitution. And that conversation is then also linked to when and how the war in Ukraine stops, because there's the mathematics of when would Russia be strong enough to actually launch an invasion, a large-scale military invasion in the Baltic states, which means a war with NATO, is linked to the sort of Russia having the time to reconstitute. Oftentimes we've heard, different sort of time ranges from 3 to 5 years. It really is related to a number of sort of sliding scale factors related to economy, related to population, et cetera, et cetera. But I really want to focus on some of the more pressing threats in the Baltic region at the moment, which are really hybrid threats. What we have is an increase in the pace and scale and intensity of gray zone activities across the region, and in fact, also across broader Europe. And in a certain extent, this is a way for Russia to, hybrid threats and hybrid activities offer Russia sometimes quite an economically palatable way of affecting European countries without using sort of very strictly sort of military means. It also is probably, in my view, is also related to some of the facts that Russia has been losing a lot of the soft power of influence in the Baltic states and the rest of Europe, particularly now after the full-scale invasion of Ukraine. Baltic states' economic dependence on Russia has gone down massively. Its electricity and so energy more broadly independence from Russia has also gone down massively. In fact, in January 2025, the Baltics are supposed to become fully sort of independent of Russia in terms of its electricity links. And they have been working on LNG independence for a number of years, and the US has also had a very important role in those efforts. So when I talk about hybrid threats, these gray zone activities, I don't want to get entangled too much in terminology. I'm trying to talk about the substance. So we have a number of things that have been happening. One is the undersea infrastructure damage that Admiral Foggo already mentioned. That is, of course, concerning, and it really shows the vulnerabilities that we have, not only in that region, but across the world, of how modern economies are really that very dependent on infrastructure that may not necessarily be well defended, and where we may not necessarily actually be able or are able to monitor the threats that well either. Then we've also had a range of different sort of low-level sabotage events. That includes, for example, attempted arson of an IKEA store in Lithuania. There's an arson of a paint factory in Poland. The breaking the car, vandalizing the cars that depend to an Estonian reporter and an Estonian, I believe, government minister. And attacking a Russian opposition member who lives in Lithuania. So these events seem to be maybe sometimes random vandalism, random attacks, but the sort of total impact of them is probably one is to sow uncertainty and a certain level of fear across the countries. There's probably also an element to try to undermine support to Ukraine. And also an element of maybe showing that, hey, the Russian opposition members or maybe independent media members who have gone to the Baltic states or other countries, that actually you are not safe in other countries either. So psychological influence operations here. We also have increased intelligence operations, increased levels of cyber attacks, including against critical infrastructure and vital services. There are Russian violations of Baltic airspace, which honestly is a continuation of trend that already existed before. And there also been Russian jamming of GPS systems, although some of that may be in fact related to the fact that Russia is tuning up its drone systems across areas such as St. Petersburg and other areas which have been targeted by Ukrainian drones. So there's a lot going on in this gray zone activity area at the moment in Baltic states. So what are the Baltics doing about all this? One, on the military front, on the capability development front, they have really been investing a lot. They're among the top investors in their defense among NATO member states, around or even exceeding 3% of GDP. There have been, so when we look at the military forces of Baltic states, we do have to remember that they basically started from scratch in early 1990s. So this has been, it is in fact quite amazing what they have been able to achieve in, 30 plus years. So they have been investing recently in the modernization of some mechanization of their land forces. The land forces is a big focus of their military investments. They've been working on their air defense systems as well. They've also, now all three of the countries have some sort of a national military service. Estonia used to be the only country that continued to have conscription since 1990, early 1990s. Lithuania has conscription, then it adopted somewhat different model. Now it has gone back. And Latvia went fully professional force, but now since last year, approximately, 2 years ago, they have reintroduced the national defense service as well, which really helps them develop a much bigger reserve force. At the same time, they're not just dependent on their reserve forces and professional military forces or active military forces. They also have very vibrant, what we would basically an equivalent of national guards. All right, so National Defense Volunteer Forces, very vibrant communities, very strong, and actually parts of them are very highly trained, and they even took part in military operations in Afghanistan and Iraq. So they also have that capability and then also pathway how to engage with civilians with specific skills. For example, cyber, there are cyber units in the National Defense Volunteer Forces. There are people with other sort of more specific, really unique skills. Also, for example, Estonia, there's a unit that engages with amateur drone pilots and really makes use and builds on the skills that hobbyist drone pilots have developed themselves.
We're going to wrap up so I can give some people an opportunity to ask you some questions from the floor.
Yeah, just a couple of sentences. One, the other thing that I wanted to highlight also is, in response to the hybrid threats, all three of the Baltic states have some form of a comprehensive societal approach to defense. What does that mean? Is really focusing on how they can engage with civilian individuals, municipalities, emergency services, and amateur hobbyist groups, etc. So really bring together all of the society, military, public, private enterprises for the one single aim of national defense. I'll stop.
Well, we'll turn it over to the questions and answers. And I know we want to be prepared for our luncheon speech today from Ambassador Courtney, who's an old friend of mine, and I'm glad to see he's here. My observation as ambassador was that the move of Finland and Sweden into NATO was the most important development in Europe since the fall of the Berlin Wall. When I was there, they made no bones to me about the fact whose team they were on. They were on our team, but they weren't members of NATO, and now they are. The other observation I have is from all three of the folks here is that Europe is very unquiet, and hybrid warfare is just warfare, and military work is just a part of the same political tools and instruments, whether you're attacking undersea cables in the Baltics or whether you're dealing with propaganda or communications. It's all the same thing, which Europe is seeing, and the United States is engaged in a hybrid war. Europe is very unquiet. So this is I think, a matter of great concern and why we're having this topic here today. Who has a question for any member of the panel from the audience? Louise.
Thank you. This question is for, thank you. This question is for any of the three of you, which is, let's talk about the fact that the U.S. Embassy was evacuated. That's not a decision that was made easily. It was made, obviously, with a great deal of information from the State Department, the Defense Department, and other things. So if that was evacuated, does that indicate that there may be an attack by Russia on the embassy? If that happens or anything nearby, that absolutely brings the U.S. into the war directly, does it not?
Well, not necessarily, but what do you all think? I mean, it's a decision at every stage.
But I would imagine that the concern would be that our embassy might be, quote, collateral damage. I would imagine, as in the past, at the start of the war, they just sort of bombed cities indiscriminately. I don't know if they, maybe some of the others know if they target, but I know they target the power plants and so forth, but it could be just sort of a general terrorist to terrorize, and that among the buildings that they might hit would be American embassy. I just can't imagine that it specifically target the American embassy.
Other embassies were evacuated as well. And I think in the totality of the national technical means that the United States, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, UCOM, the combatant commander, and the Ukrainian intelligence services probably saw something that looked threatening to a particular region of Kyiv. And isn't it interesting that it happened within 2 days of the launch of ATACMS missiles into Russian territory? The Russians, of course, said, well, we knocked them down. I don't believe that. I think those ATACMS are lethal, and they're big warheads. I think they did some damage, and I think the Russians are pretty spun up about it. So this could be a tit for tat. So somehow somebody got some information that made it look like these embassies were vulnerable to either collateral damage, a direct attack. Pretty hard to prove, isn't it? The Americans always do this when something bad happens. Well, we don't know if it was intentional. We have to do the forensics. We'll do an investigation. We'll name a committee. I mean, come on. If they hit the U.S. Embassy, it was probably intentional. So I think caution was appropriate in getting people out of there, and we'll see how long they stay away, whether or not they go back in a couple of days or a couple of weeks or not at all.
The question, yes, Tim.
So, Admiral, when and by whom was the decision made to exit our Navy from the Black Sea?
I can only speculate, sir. I wasn't there at the time. This was my successor, Admiral Bob Burke. But when ships are directed in and out of the Black Sea, you have to use the parameters of the Montreux Treaty. So you can go in, you have to give notice about 3 weeks in advance. You can go in for 21 days. But we always had some kind of a rotational cycle of U.S. Navy warships in there for about 120 to 240 days a year. And sometimes under a NATO flag or a U.S. flag only, doing exercises with Bulgaria, Ukraine, the Turks, and most importantly, the Romanians. And the Romanians are the ones that are really holding the ground there. So I don't know who gave the direction. Could have been something as easy as, well, we suggest that you not put any more U.S. warships in there so as not to exacerbate President Putin and have him cross the line and cause a war. Guess what? He did anyway. So I think it was political.
Exactly. Yeah. And in what year was that? I didn't realize you can't.
2021, December of 2021. Those ships came out. We've never put a U.S. warship back in. Now, I asked General Mattis about this at the Cohen Group about 2 years ago. And he said, we don't want a smoking datum of a U.S. warship. Well, I'm not suggesting that we charge up into the Mariupol or something like that, or, to the Kerch Bridge. But I think maintaining a presence in there would have maintained the status quo. Mm-hmm. Now the status quo is no U.S. warships. And it's pretty hard to get back in there because you got to finagle this with the Turks. They still have the edict of If you're not a riparian nation, stay out. You're welcome.
We may have time for one more. We may have time for one more, and then we'll break for lunch. Does anybody else have another question for the panel? If not, this is a very distinguished panel, and we're lucky to have you here. And thank you very much for all of your insight.